Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It is a matter of utmost privilege and honor to have with us Mr. Jairam Ramesh, one of India's foremost leaders of the world and of the country as well. Jairam Ramesh sir has been an inspiration to almost anyone and everyone in the country. His credentials, academic and otherwise, are too brilliant to even fathom. Sir has been a graduate of the prestigious IIT Bombay. From there on, he went on to study at the Carnegie Mellon University. Sir has also been the founding member of the Indian School of Business, Hyderabad. Sir is currently the Rajya Sabha MP from Karnataka, and in his prior career and in his prior appointments, has also been the Environment Minister, the Drinking Water Minister, and the Rural Development Minister in erstwhile governments. Sir, on behalf of the student community, sir, it is an absolute honor to have you with us this evening, sir.
I'm delighted to be with you, and I look forward to this interaction.
Thank you, sir. My name is Atish Mathur, sir, and though a lawyer by qualification and only by qualification, I primarily teach public policy, law, and governance on the platform, and I would be having a free-flowing, policy-based conversation with you, and to understand how can we make this country better than it already is, sir. With your permission, sir, may we begin? Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. So the first thing that I think we could touch upon is how the pandemic has really pushed us into alternate ways of living. Courts all over the country have also resorted to e-hearings. Things have adapted to a different form. But for some reason, the parliament of our country hasn't really adapted to the way the pandemic has been. So how do you think the parliament can evolve the way it functions in and around the pandemic and even beyond it, sir?
I agree with you entirely. The Prime Minister meets the Chief Ministers virtually. He meets the heads of government and heads of state virtually. Supreme Court and the High Courts are meeting virtually. We are doing this interaction virtually. We have, we are Zoom and Google Meets and everything else has overtaken us. And we are responding to a situation where face-to-face meetings have become virtually impossible. Under these circumstances, I would have thought that Parliament also would have responded. For example, even today, there are parliaments all over the world which are meeting, but our parliament is not meeting. We are not even allowed to meet virtually for some reason. The argument that is given is that rules don't permit it. But there are so many rules that get broken. And this is an extraordinary situation. So I don't see why Parliament, I can understand 500 members not meeting virtually. I can understand 245 members of the Rajya Sabha not meeting virtually. But the standing committees of Parliament. For example, I chair the Standing Committee on Science and Technology, Environment, Forests and Climate Change. It is 31 members. Now, what's the big deal in having a virtual meeting of 31 members? So I have been repeatedly pleading with the Speaker of the Lok Sabha, the Chairman of the Rajya Sabha, but I'm afraid I have not been very successful. So the Indian Parliament's record since March of 2020 is not very, very good. We've had some meetings, we've had sessions, face-to-face, with social distancing and with masks and so on. And those sessions have been curtailed to 4 hours each. 4 hours for the Lok Sabha, 4 hours in the Rajya Sabha. And we are, I'm hoping, under normal circumstance, normally the monsoon session of Parliament meets by middle of July. So let's see, if we are actually going to meet middle of July. But I think Parliament committees should have been allowed to meet virtually.
Sir, interestingly, a parallel can be drawn with the way right to information as an idea sort of executes in the country. So people who've often said that it is not feasible to have the parliament or at least parliamentary committees go online is because there is a threat to state secrets. Now, if state secrets could be exempted from being disclosed in the RTI, so if there is a committee meeting which is supposed to discuss quote unquote state secrets, we are of course making sure that that meeting does not happen online. But for a larger part of it, we could.
I can understand if there is a standing committee on defense.
Right.
There are some state secrets.
Right.
But I am chairman of a standing committee, for the last 3 years. And I've been a member of a standing committee on health, for example, for 5 years. There's nothing secret, nothing even confidential. I mean, these are all, health is a public issue, is the most important public issue. Environment is a public issue. Science and technology is a public issue. So I can understand standing committee on defense, you don't want to, have virtual meetings. One can make an argument. That's a bogus argument, but I can buy that argument. But what about the other committees? 25, 26, 27 committees. I mean, I certainly can't see what is confidential. In my own committee, for example, where we are discussing vaccines, where we are discussing pollution, where we are discussing issues of climate change, biodiversity. What is secret about it? I mean, everybody should be involved. So this is a bahana. This is an excuse. If you want to meet virtually, we can meet virtually. And I'm afraid this remains a blemish on Parliament's record. That when we ought to have been meeting and discussing these issues of public concern. And today the biggest issue is COVID and its impacts, environmental impacts, for example. The vaccine issue, for example. These are all issues which the Standing Committee on Health, the Standing Committee on Science, the Standing Committee on Environment, will be interested in. There's a Standing Committee on Chemicals and Fertilizers which looks at the whole issue of medicines, drugs, pharmaceuticals. This is very much a public issue. So, there's this confidentiality argument is a completely bogus argument. Completely bogus.
Right. So speaking of standing committees, I think the way standing committees were envisioned to function when we became independent, vis-a-vis the way parliamentary committees or standing committees or departmental committees function today, I think there's a stark difference in the vision which is sort of being let down across years. I mean, when we see international examples of CEOs of some of the most powerful IT corporations in the world, being called to specific committees of legislators across the world, we see interrogations with a possible Supreme Court appointment in the US on grounds of, say, sexual harassment. When we see CEOs of IT companies being questioned on privacy, being questioned on their role in elections. So the kind of work that happens and the way these parliamentary committees function all across the world versus the way they function in India, unless, of course, you are deeply interested in politics or you are a UPSC aspirant, people don't even know the importance of parliamentary committees. In fact, they also tend to be the ones who keep the record straight for a lot of constitutional bodies as well. The way they can become more accountable, the way they can become more transparent. So why are we not exploiting the potential of parliamentary committees? They can truly be groundbreaking.
With the standing committees goes back only to the mid-90s.
Right.
This is only in 93, 94, that in a systematic manner. I mean, in the 50s, we had select committees. We had joint committees of parliament, but those were ad hoc. They were for a subject. For example, there was a select committee on the reorganization of states, in the 1950s, headed by Govind Vallabh Pant, who was then the minister. But this system of standing committees, department-related standing committees, 30 odd of them, it goes back to the mid-90s. And the basic purpose of these standing committees is to examine legislation. See, in India, unlike, say, in the US, it's the executive that promotes and gets the legislation, and Parliament debates on it. It does not originate in Parliament. The ideas may originate, but the legislation does not originate with members. Like, for example, in the US, individual senators, congressmen can move bills and those bills get passed and they become laws. That's not the case in India. So the most important contribution that the standing committees have made in India is to examine legislation that is prepared by the government of the day. And I can tell you, I have been a member and I have also been a minister. So I have looked at a standing committee from both sides. And 99% of the cases, the standing committee has added value to the legislation, and governments have accepted very many. For example, when I was rural development minister, the standing committee on rural development chaired by Sumitra Mahajan, who later became the speaker. I mean, they made 28 recommendations on the draft land acquisition law in 2011, and I accepted 26 out of the 28 recommendations. There are many committees where the recommendations. I mean, for example, now the DNA identification bill came to the standing committee, of which was a chairman, and we prepared a report. We studied it for almost a year and a half, and we gave a report. So the most valuable role of the standing committee is to examine the legislation when the legislation gets referred to it. Also, the standing committee can take up public issues and submit reports on those public issues. Like, for example, we have taken up the issue of pollution and public health, and we are preparing a report on that. So these are subjects that get taken up by the standing committee. But I would say that the single most important function of the standing committee, the most valuable contribution that the standing committees make, is to examine legislation clause by clause that is referred to it. And one advantage of the standing committee, because it's not public, unlike in the UK and the US, there is no theatrical grandstanding. There are people who very often in standing committees, when I have been a member, I have taken a stand which is contrary to the stand of my party. So in standing committees, we don't take party affiliation very seriously. We look at the merit of the case, and by and large, we try to bring about a consensus document. Not always unanimous, but by and large a consensus document, which then gets submitted to Parliament and it gets debated in Parliament. So the standing committee's role, I think, in my view, that is very important, the examination of legislation. As far as examination of public issues is concerned, that record there varies. But when we examine legislation, we call witnesses, and those witnesses are very critical of the government. I was a member of of a committee which looked at the surrogacy, the rules of surrogacy, and what the government was proposing, and we gave a very critical report. And this was based on the evidence we got from the experts, from surrogate mothers themselves. So one advantage is their confidentiality gets important. When you're taking evidence, many people don't want to appear too critical of the government in public, and rightly so. We are still not a mature democracy where those in power take criticism. I'm afraid when I was also in government, we also had a tendency of not taking criticism in its right spirit. So also in the current government, whichever the government, maybe Nehru's government was an exception, because Mr. Nehru was an exception. But therefore, the standing committee, the fact that it is in camera, the fact that it is not televised, gives it a certain dignity, a gravitas. Now, when you look at televised debates of Parliament, people are, grandstanding. People are speaking to their constituencies. They're not speaking on the bill. They're not speaking on the issue, but they're speaking with some larger political agenda in mind. But I agree with you. The standing committee system must be strengthened. It must be made more analytical, more rigorous. I have been arguing that the standing committee should be allowed to take professionals for 2 years, for 3 years on a long-term contract basis, so that we take up, like in the US, like it happens in the US, so that we can take up public issues. So that's there are reforms in the standing committee system, and I'm 100% sure. Structural reforms are very, very important.
In fact, like for example, the National Medical Commission, which now replaces the Medical Council of India, was something which was introduced in the previous Lok Sabha, was lapsed, and then was reintroduced in the current Lok Sabha, and of course was passed eventually. As you said, the standing committee played a vital role with respect to that specific bill, because the original bill had some provisions empowering non-strictly allopathic doctors to, do a bridge course and then, give almost equivalent medical advice. And the standing committee, I think, had taken into consideration the large set of representations given by medical professionals all across the country, and then recommended that such a provision should then be deleted from the law. And I think the final version of the National Medical Commission, which came out, did not take into account that provision and was removed from the actuality of the bill. So from a legislation improvement perspective, or a reality check on the kind of laws that we pass, yes, you're right. The standing committee does a phenomenal job. But democracy also is a lot about witnessing substantive issues to be discussed. So what happens to the general average voter in the country is we only see, say, the outcome of the surrogacy bill or the outcome of the land acquisition bill, because, as you said, the substantive discussions are happening within the closed doors of the parliamentary committees. Now, which then sort of, again, brings us back to the larger discussion. And of course, it is often a very rhetorical question, but don't you think we could, say, possibly have defined slots for sectoral discussions in the parliament on a monthly basis? Like, we could discuss, say, education problems, or at least 1 hour in the month that the parliament is in session. At least that will bring more substantive debates in front of the country.
We do have that. After the budget gets presented, there is a debate on the demands for grants. Now, for example, about 4 to 5 ministries get taken up in the Lok Sabha, and 4 to 5 ministries get taken up in the Rajya Sabha. Things like agriculture, health, tribal affairs, railways, welfare of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes and backward classes. So there is a discussion after the budget, in the budget session, on the working of ministries. And this happens every year, by the way. So between the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha, about 8 to 10 ministries get taken up, and members participate, and we discuss the general issues, nothing related to specific legislation, but the general issues of that topic. Secondly, in every session, you have things like short duration discussion. You have a calling attention motion.
Right.
So in every session, we take up, we've taken up farmers' issues in the past. We've taken up COVID, issues in the past. So there is the calling attention, and there is a short duration in every session. So there are ample opportunities, for raising these issues. But let me go back to one point that you made about introducing legislation in the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha. See, the Rajya Sabha, and this is particularly interesting and important for aspiring civil service aspirants. Those who are interested in pursuing civil service career. See, the Rajya Sabha is a continuing body. The Lok Sabha dissolves itself, normally once in 5 years, if not earlier. So what happens is, when you introduce a bill in the Lok Sabha, and if the Lok Sabha gets dissolved, that bill automatically gets out. You have to reintroduce the bill. And this has happened numerous instances. In the Rajya Sabha, once you have introduced a bill, that bill can continue for 30 years, for 40 years. And there have been instances. For example, the women's reservation bill. It was passed by the Rajya Sabha almost 12 years ago.
Yes, sir.
And it's not yet passed by the Lok Sabha yet. So the Rajya Sabha, being a continuing house, 1/3 of the Rajya Sabha retires every 2 years. But it's a continuing house, unlike the Lok Sabha, which gets dissolved, when the government loses its majority or loses a vote on a money bill, or it's get dissolved because, its term is over. So this is a very important distinction. So many governments, all governments, sometimes end up introducing controversial legislation in the Rajya Sabha, because then it, continues to be on the agenda. Whereas, if you introduce in the Lok Sabha, unless you're sure that you can get it through quickly, If the Lok Sabha dissolves, then the bills dissolve. So that's a very important distinction to be made between the Rajya Sabha and the Lok Sabha. And of course, the other big distinction is that in the Rajya Sabha, the issues of states become more important, whereas in the Lok Sabha, people tend to argue from the point of view of their constituencies, generally. Whereas, remember, in the Rajya Sabha is often called the upper house and the other one is called the lower house. Actually, this is wrong terminology. The Constitution does not recognize upper house and lower house. The Constitution only recognizes Lok Sabha, House of the People, and Rajya Sabha, the Council of States. So that's the only thing that the Constitution recognizes. So in the Rajya Sabha, what happens is, normally we represent states. For example, I represent a state. I'm elected by the MLAs of a state. So the Rajya Sabha tends to take up issues which are of federal in character, which impinge on the rights, responsibilities, problems of the states. It's not that in Lok Sabha it doesn't get taken up. In Lok Sabha it does get taken up, but much more structurally, much more systematically, it gets taken up in the Rajya Sabha.
So interestingly, Rajya Sabha at the end of the day is still a political house. So political majorities at the level of the state, in terms of political majorities at state legislative assemblies, would also determine the way Rajya Sabhas function. In fact, when one sort of tries to understand that the ideological idea of setting up the Rajya Sabha was to ensure that there is an unbiased, academic, a thorough debate on issues that truly affect the states, because in almost every manner, anything that affects the country as a large will affect the states in some way or another. So in one way, every issue is in fact a state issue. It may not be a state-specific issue, but it will definitely have some impact or not. Now, what happens is when there is, let us say, political party A, which also starts winning a lot of seats at the state legislative assemblies. So in a sense, the Rajya Sabha becomes an extension of the Lok Sabha in terms of the way people are expressing their opinions. And more often than not, it is often thought that we could have a uniform representation from states to the Rajya Sabha because it will then give some sort of an equality of representation. Do you think that makes sense? Do you think Rajya Sabha has still become very political?
System. In America,
right,
the House of Representatives is based on population, whereas the US Senate has 100 senators, and every state has got 2 senators. So the strength is 100. So California, New York, more populous states, which have population in millions, have 2 senators, and Wyoming, which has 300,000 or 400,000 population, have 2 senators. That, I'm afraid, was not in the Constituent Assembly that was discussed, and population became the basis of representation. I think it was the most logical, the most equitable. Unlike in the UK, where the House of Lords, is really Lords, Henry III, peers, and so on. Rajya Sabha is an elected body. House of Lords is not a elected body; it's a nominated body, or a hereditary body. Whereas Rajya Sabha is an elected body. I am not directly elected by the people; I am elected by the MLAs. So that in what you are saying, Goa will have the same number of MPs in the Rajya Sabha as UP. Whereas today Goa has 1 member and UP, has 36 members.
Right.
I think population is the only way. I mean, population is the way for delimiting Lok Sabha constituencies. And population has been the basis for allocating seats to different states, even in the Rajya Sabha. This was discussed in the Constituent Assembly. And I think, in all fairness, sometimes I do feel sad. Nagaland has got 1, Mizoram has got 1, Manipur has got 1. UP has got 36. So yeah, I mean, sometimes, it feels it's inequitable, but That's life, So
So
you need a formula,
would you then say that, all right, because population is our only mechanism or only suitable mechanism for representation, do you then only equitable, the only equitable method of representation? In that scenario, do you think we could exempt Rajya Sabha members from defection law so that they can truly vote the way they want to and not be sort of under the larger pressures of
Well, the Rajya Sabha is a political body. It's not an NGO. It's not a charitable organization. People are elected by political parties. I represent a political party. Everybody represents a political party. But the expectation of the founding fathers that the Rajya Sabha would be a body of dispassionate debate where people rise above party considerations, that has not been fulfilled. I think after the mid-70s particularly, I would say up to the early 60s, mid-60s, this happened, So people, could take positions which are contrary to the party position, But you're right. The criticism of the Rajya Sabha, that in the Rajya Sabha, when Rajya Sabha is meant to be a political body, but a political body in which the members express their views in an objective manner, that has not been fulfilled. You see, you cannot be neutral in a party democracy. When you're representing parties, you cannot be neutral. I cannot be neutral because I represent a party, but I can be objective. I think you must distinguish
between the two.
Objective from being neutral. Are members of the Rajya Sabha always objective? No. And they're never neutral. Never neutral, So it's difficult, because you have party whips. And then when you have voting, you vote according to party considerations. It's very rare. I mean, in the 17 years that I have been in Parliament, I have not come across any instance where somebody has actually got up and said, I oppose what my party is saying. I have not seen it happen. I certainly haven't done it. I may have hinted at it here and there, in a golmol tarika, but directly no. So to that extent, your point is valid.
So which sort of then drives us into specific realms of policy. And one of the most important portfolios that you've held is that you've been the environment minister of this country. So at the outset, why isn't environment policy the topmost priority for India across years, across governments? I mean, we're always on a firefighting basis because internationally we go and we have the Paris Agreement, we do place our stands at the Kyoto, and it's been all there. But as a country, why isn't environment right next up with, let's say, an agriculture or right next to home affairs? Because it's as important as anything else could be.
Well, that's because, the priority in India is seen to be growth. The priority in India is seen to be employment. And it is. With our demographic challenges, we're adding 10 million people every year to the labor force. And you need to create 10 million jobs a year, So you need faster urbanization, you need faster industrialization, you need factories, you need roads, you need railways, you need infrastructure. So environment tends to take a back seat, It tends to take a back seat in terms of practice, not in terms of paying ritual obeisance, We still do Mangalarti to environment every day. When it comes to the act, we do the puja.
Right.
The puja part of the environment, we are experts. But when it comes to actions, ultimately, we still want a 6-lane highway. We still want a broad gauge. We still need a power plant here or a fertilizer factory there. So this trade-off between faster urbanization, faster industrialization, faster growth, and the need to protect the environment, is very real. I mean, many of our good coal mines, for example, are in forest areas. How fast should we be extracting coal from these forests, or iron ore, for example? So these trade-offs are real. These choices have to get made. Now, most countries in the world, certainly the Western countries, certainly the developed countries, and certainly China also, has followed the traditional grow now, pay later. For 20 years or for 25 years, you have 8%, 9% growth, and then we worry about the consequences of growth later. This is what the Americans did. This is what the Europeans have done. This is what the Brazilians have done. This is what the Chinese are doing. They're now grappling with the environmental consequences of their rapid growth. So that's one model. That's the only model economics teaches us. Grow now, pay later.
Pay later.
But we have to find a different model. Gandhi had a different model, but the Gandhian model also has its limitations. Not everybody wants to live in a village. Not everybody wants to spin a charka, not everybody wants to work on the farms. Everybody wants factory employment, white collar employment, manufacturing employment. They want to come to the cities, standard of, the quality of life, the standard of living. So Gandhi had a model, no doubt about it. But how relevant the Gandhian model is at the scale that we are talking about, I have my serious doubts. So I think we have to come up with a, and this is not a standard textbook formula. This is something that we learn day to day. We learn by doing. But one thing that we have learned in the last few years, you cannot pollute your way to prosperity, because pollution is already extracting a very heavy public health cost. In fact, COVID-19 in many ways is a reflection of imbalance in the environment, this link between public health and environment is very, very close. So grow now, pay later. That's the model that we also have adopted. But I think we have to be more careful in the future, because environment is not some middle class, elitist, concern. Environment is about livelihoods. It's about water. It's about land. It's about access to forest resources. It's about livelihoods, and I've often said that Western countries, it's lifestyle environmentalism, whereas in India, it is livelihood environmentalism. You have to worry about livelihoods.
And something as simple as, so let us say, segregating your waste the way it is generated, to let us say to have more eco-friendly, compliant buildings. A lot of those things are policies that have to be implemented. It's not that we do not have those policies. We do to a certain extent.
Laws, by the way.
Exactly. One of the most well-written environment laws in the world.
Aggressive environmental laws in the world. True. At a time when the world was not conscious, India enacted these laws. We have a Wildlife Protection Act of 72. We have a Water Pollution Control Act of 74. We have a Forest Conservation Act of 1980. We have an Air Pollution Control Act of 1981. We have an Environmental Protection Act of 1986. And we have the Forest Rights Act of 2006. We have progressive legislation, we have institutions, we have regulations, but enforcement has been very, very weak. And enforcement has been weak for the reason I mentioned to you, that every government, irrespective of political persuasion, sees the headline GDP growth, and environment is seen to be a road blocker. It's seen to be a road barrier. Regulation. That's all.
Just get it out of the way before you get to your end goal.
So this requires a mindset change. And that's why now we are talking of sustainable development. We are talking of not just rapid growth. We are talking not just of inclusive growth, but we are also talking of sustainable growth. Which means that we deal with pollution, we deal with deforestation, not 20 years from now, but here and now. So these are difficult choices that governments have to make. Sometimes there's no textbook. I mean, there's no formula. In any book that you can pick up and say that I'm going to adopt this formula.
In fact, so when we do sort of circle around that it's essentially the enforcement of our environmental protocols, which is a larger question mark. It is often seen that the judiciary, more specific to the National Green Tribunal, seems to be the knight in shining armor, with the kind of pronouncements they give, with the kind of directions that they often issue across varying proportions. Now, this also is a form of judicial activism. It is a form of the judiciary filling a void that has been created in the governance ecospace. So something as simple as, if you've got the Indian Administrative Service, you've got the Indian Police Service, you're now looking at the Indian Engineering Service. We now have the Indian Skill Development Service also, sir. A specific service just dedicated to skill development. Why don't we have an Indian Environment Service? A service...
We have an Indian Economic Service. We have an Indian Forest Service.
Yes.
There's been a lot of demand for now having an Indian Public Health Service.
Public Health Service. Yes, sir. Yes.
Supposed to be a public health service, before independence. So Indian Medical Service. In fact,
Indian Judicial Service also has been on the cards.
Big demand for having an Indian Judicial Service also. Well, these are and Indian Environment Service, I'm not so sure. Indian Forest Service itself, is a very complex animal to deal with, because the Indian Forest Service is a central service.
It's a central service.
But forests are owned by the state government.
So it's an all India service, in fact. The Forest Service, it's an all India service.
Yeah. But it's like the IAS or the Indian Economic Service or the Revenue Service. But the forests are owned by the state government. So the ownership rights of the forests. Now, but the Indian Forest Service has done a good job. I think so. I'm not entirely sure that an Indian Environment Service is required. I think public health and the judiciary far more important for having all India services.
And sir, how do we get back to the government holding the reins for ecological improvement in terms of policies in the country? We always look at the judiciary. It's the second part of my question. The judiciary becomes, our make-believe agent who's the true proponent of ecological.
The judiciary has played a very important role in environmental management in our country. And that reflects executive vacuum.
Yes, the void.
When executive is weak or doesn't want to do anything, the judiciary steps in. For example, in Delhi, 7,000 buses got converted from being diesel into CNG buses. A large part of it was because of the Supreme Court intervention. All the forest cases in the Supreme Court have come because of the Godavarman case. Right. In the Supreme Court. The National Green Tribunal, which was set up. In fact, I was a minister when it was set up in 2010. And we are one of the few countries in the world, maybe 3 or 4 countries, which has a National Green Tribunal, which looks at environmental cases. So the judiciary has played a very important role. Many people would say that it has interfered with the functioning of the executive. But as I said, my view when I was minister was I use the judiciary as an ally. And judicial activism very often is a reflection of executive inactivism, or executive misactivism.
Misactivism.
So I think on the whole, the judiciary has played an important role, But it's important to have that judiciary The National Green Tribunal, for example, a very, very important institution. And that acts as a check on the executive. You need a balancing force on the executive, where people can go. The different, for example, the National Green Tribunal, you and I anybody can go. Any citizen can go, which was not the case before.
And anybody can appear in person also.
The whole, our experience has been that the judiciary has been a positive force for environmental management.
Right. So a very strong component of the larger ecosystem and umbrella of our discussion environment is water. We are going to have a water crisis. We are in the middle of a water crisis. We just don't talk about it. It's something that we never see reported in mainstream media. We don't see discussions in the parliament on it. We don't see enough of government talks on it. So why are we ignoring a water crisis that we're in?
Ignoring the water crisis. I think the successive governments have tried to grapple with the water crisis. Whether it is irrigation water, which was very important in the 50s and 60s, hence the emphasis on multi-purpose dams, Bakra, Hirakud, Nagarjuna Sagar. Then came groundwater, which was a very important trigger and stimulus to the Green Revolution in Punjab, Haryana, Western UP. And then we had the drinking water, crisis. So we had the water policy. The Ministry of Water Resources got created in 85 or 86. Now recently the Ministry of Jal Shakti has been created. So governments have tried to grapple, with the water supply issue. But the fact is that there are many water-stressed areas from the point of view of quantity. But there are also places where quantity is not the problem, but quality is the problem. You have fluoride, you have excess iron, you have arsenic in the entire Indo-Gangetic belt. So water is a very big issue, and we have states fighting over water. Water is not a central subject. Water is not being nationalized. There's been a huge demand that water should figure in the central list. It figures in the states list. So there are a lot of interstate disputes which have gone on for years, and still continuing. So it's a difficult issue to tackle, But as I said, over the years, we have taken very many steps in terms of irrigation water, which is important for agricultural production. Groundwater, again, very crucial for the Green Revolution. Drinking water, enhancing the supply of drinking water. We had the technology mission on water, which I was involved in, which located water sources for problem villages, and which also tried to ensure a basic supply of 40 liters per capita per day, so that there was a more equitable distribution of water. But it's a difficult subject to deal with. It's a perennial issue, because of the demographic pressures. At some stage, I think we have to pay far greater attention to desalination than we have. We have a few desalination plants in the country. Chennai, for example. In Gujarat, we have some desalination plants. But desalination is an important area. But I'm not a great believer in techno fixes, although I'm a technologist myself. I'm not a great believer of techno fixes. So you need better water management. You need to improve water use efficiency. We need to price water much better. Urban water supply is still subsidized fairly heavily. We need to reduce the losses in water distribution. So there are multiple actions required on the waterfront, but it remains one of the central issues of Indian development policy.
Sir, in to that effect, we recently also passed the Interstate Water Disputes Act to sort of more amicably look at a faster resolution of disputes. We really haven't seen that happen. And of course, as you said, technology isn't the primary solution to the water crisis. There is also a fundamental mentality change which is required, because the government can only play a limited role in the availability of water and improving the quality of it. In the same way that people need to understand cleanliness is important. People need to understand the importance of sanitation. So people also need to understand the importance of water conservation in their own sphere. Yeah. Now, how do we do that? Because that's the fundamental problem.
Absolutely, you're 100% right. For example, if you're talking of Swachh Bharat without water doesn't make much sense. You have water supply also for a Swachh Bharat. So that's why, water and sanitation have always been seen as two sides of the same coin. Public education, public awareness, public consciousness, public mobilization, very, very important. And particularly in water-stressed areas. Parts of Rajasthan, for example, continue to be water-stressed. Parts of Gujarat continue to be water-stressed. In UP and Bihar, in the Indo-Gangetic belt, it's not so much availability of water as it is the quality. It's the arsenic issue that I talked about. In the southern part of the country, availability is a problem, because the perennial rivers are in the northern part of the country, and the peninsular rivers are not perennial rivers. And hence many people see this grandiose dream of interlinking of rivers. It's been talked about for 100 years that we should interlink the Brahmaputra, the Ganga, the Godavari, the Kaveri. Interlinking of rivers is an engineer's delight.
A dream also.
An environmentalist's nightmare. The Supreme Court also, by the way, has been a great push for interlinking of rivers. I have taken a very strong position against the interlinking of rivers, because it has grave ecological consequences. It has grave social consequences as well. And this notion that water is going waste into the ocean is completely a wrong notion. It's not. It's part of the natural cycle. So, if we're going to start damming all the river that is going to go into, all the water that is going into the oceans, I think that's a bizarre that goes against all canons of basic hydrology. So we need to avoid big, grandiose techno fixes. And interlinking of rivers is a very seductive idea. And this is one of the areas where the Supreme Court is completely misguided. Completely. In fact, India's first interlinking project is the Ken Betwa.
Yes.
UP and Madhya Pradesh. Grave environmental consequences. But the Supreme Court, has been a great votary of this.
And the damage to the neighboring flora fauna is also immense when you start
the Panna Tiger Reserve, which is more than a tiger reserve. It's really a biodiversity reserve. It's going to be virtually destroyed. The core area of the Panna Tiger Reserve. It's called a tiger reserve. I don't want to call it a tiger reserve. It's a biodiversity hotspot. It's going to be completely destroyed, because of the Ken Betwa project. But in more than that, it's the ecological consequences. If you're going to have a large-scale interlinking of the type that the Supreme Court, for example, has envisaged.
So, what is truly amazing is, over the last 45 minutes or so, we've spoken about the Parliament. We've spoken about parliamentary committees. We've spoken about the role of the opposition. We've spoken about e-parliament, so to speak. We've spoken about environment. We've spoken about the water crisis. We've also sort of stumbled upon judicial activism, interlinking of water reserves. So you are exactly what an ideal UPSC aspirant should be. from a teacher point of view, sir. And I know, sir, your credentials are far beyond anybody to fathom. But, sir, even now with such a glorious career with so many years in public service, how do you keep yourself so well read with such articulation of the problems and solutions? Because that's exactly what a UPSC aspirant needs. So how do you do this, sir?
I don't have much of a social life. I don't. I try to spend whatever time I have reading, and that's the only advice I can give to a UPSC aspirant. Read. Read. I read voracious. I'm a voracious reader. I read not just newspapers, not just magazines, not just WhatsApp and websites, but I read books. I read journals. So that's been with me right from the beginning, and that's the only advice I can give to people who ask me. What is it that I can tell them? I can say that, well, I have no formula. Everybody is unique. Everybody has to find his or her own unique way. But certainly, from my own experience, I would say that reading has certainly helped me a lot. And that's you have to keep yourself updated. It's not just enough to have read something 20 years ago and then live on that for the rest of your life. You have to change. You have to keep changing. You have to understand, how things are evolving.
In fact, sir, you do occasionally and frequently write for some of the leading newspapers of the country, and your articles are largely centric on environment policy and things that we can do. So, whenever, and current affairs is an integral form, and one of the papers that you write for is sort of the staple paper for UPSC aspirants, and every time your article comes up, we sit exactly like this in the morning, that sir's article has come, now we need to read it, because we need to read it 5 times, because this has to be taught, it is that important. So that kind of precision in terms of understanding the problems, the solutions, the larger schemes involved, a lot of data comes with a lot of reading, in fact. And sir, in many ways than not, a career in politics as opposed to a career in the civil services do have some fundamental similarities to the fact that there are ups and downs. It is an uncertain career. You have to keep going without really knowing what lies ahead for you. Uncertainty becomes the natural order of things. Chaos is the natural state of affairs, whether it is in politics or the civil services or the preparation of it.
The civil service from politics.
Yes.
Politics is more uncertain and more risky than the civil service. In civil service, the day you join, the day you will retire. But in politics, you never know. Many people don't even retire from politics. And that's the problem. They don't know when.
They should.
And civil service, there is a structure. There is a hierarchy, there is a structure, there is a ladder. You can't paratroop in the civil service, whereas you can easily paratroop in politics. For a number of reasons. In many ways, I'm a paratrooper in politics. I'm an intellectual paratrooper. I didn't come from the ranks in politics. So I joined at a fairly high level because of my educational and professional background. So there is a place for that type of political personality as well. So it's not it's unfair to compare the two, because civil service is more rigid, more certain, more stratified, more rule driven, more procedure driven, whereas politics is more seat of the pants. It's much more risky. And I've often said politics is 80% down and 20% up. You never know what's going to happen. And you have to take the good along with the bad. But what the politics does is gives you resilience. It gives you exposure to different situations, to different people. It gives you resilience. And whereas the civil service, you are bound by a code. You're bound by a professional code, whereas in politics you are not. Your accountability is different. So the systems of accountability in politics are different than systems in civil service. By the way, civil servants not always make good politicians. Some of the best politicians in India have been people who have not been extraordinarily well educated. I mean, one of the best chief ministers India has ever seen is Mr. Kamaraj, who was chief minister for 8 years in then Madras. Educated up to 7 standard or 8 standard. Many people like him. Not highly educated, but phenomenal success as political leaders.
And success itself
has to learn from politicians. There's a tendency to criticize politicians too much in our country, and the constraints under which political workers carry out their day-to-day functions. These are complementary. I don't see them as competitive. Civil service is the steel frame. You're holding up the structure. But politics is the fuel. It's political activity. Democracy is the fuel.
In fact, sir, given recent talks, and of course there have been minor developments on that front, several appointments have also been made. What is paratrooping in politics is also referred to as lateral entry in civil services. And for people who are, looking at a career starting right from the very beginning, lateral entry is something that often concerns them. It is something that they have a question mark over. In one line, so what is your view on lateral entry? Do you think it is necessary?
I was a lateral entry into civil service in 1980.
Right.
And I've also been a lateral entry in politics. So my life is, if I were to write my autobiography or memoirs, which I won't, I would probably call it lateral entry. But, lateral entry is good. It renews the system. Manmohan Singh was a lateral entry. Montek Singh Ahluwalia is a lateral entry. Vijay Kelkar was a lateral entry.
Raghuram Rajan.
Raghuram Rajan, yeah, but he didn't. Raghuram Rajan, I won't put in the same category because he didn't last long. I would define a lateral entrant as somebody who enters at a mid-level or a senior level and continues. And these people are, they've been very distinguished people, scientists, economists. So I would say I wouldn't, I think lateral entry has a place, but lateral entry has to be based on certain objective criteria. It has to bring value addition. It has to bring some professional specialization. So I'm not one who's skeptical about lateral entrance, but my advice to all civil servants is that after a while, one of the great advantages of our civil service is it gives many opportunities for our civil servants to study further, to take some time off. And I know many people, many civil servants, my people who have worked with me, whom I have encouraged to take time off, do a master's, do a PhD, come back into the civil service. It's happened all the time. Yeah.
It also adds to the way you look at things, it sort of enlarges your dimension and makes you understand things in a different manner also. So education abroad, I think the government also has a lot of tie-ups with universities leading of the world.
These things you have to take it, after a while, after 7-8 years.
Yes.
You need to recharge your batteries, you need to. So I think there are ample opportunities in the civil service, for doing this. I know a lot of people. I know people who have worked with me, who have taken time off, gone out, come back. Some have gone out of India, some have studied within India. So it all depends.
So on that note, I believe we've taken quite a lot of your time, and
wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much, sir. So on behalf of Unacademy and all of our students, thank you so much, sir. It has been an honor.
All the very best.
Thank you, sir. So I will stop the recording now, sir. Thank you, sir, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.